George Washington was born on February 22, 1732, in a modest plantation house in Westmoreland County, Virginia. His father, Augustine Washington, was a moderately prosperous planter, while his mother, Mary Ball Washington, was a strong-willed and pious woman who raised George with discipline and traditional values. Life on the plantation wasn't glamorous. George was the third of 6 children from Augustine and Mary, and he had older half-siblings from his father's first marriage. This blended family setup was common in colonial America, and George quickly learned the dynamics of hierarchy and respect. Augustine Washington was deeply involved in his children's lives, especially George's early development. He introduced George to surveying, mathematics, and classical education. However, this fatherly guidance was cut short when Augustine died suddenly in 1743, when George was just 11 years old. This event marked a major shift in George's life. Without his father's wealth or influence to guide him, George's social rise would depend on his own merit, a theme that would follow him throughout life. Let's set the record straight. The famous story of young George chopping down a cherry tree and then confessing with, "I cannot tell a lie," is a complete fabrication. It was invented by Mason Locke Weems, one of Washington's early biographers, to sell books and teach moral lessons. In truth, there's no evidence this ever happened, but it does speak to how eager Americans were to see Washington as a moral role model. Mary Ball was known for her strict parenting. Unlike many elite families, she didn't send George overseas for education. She believed in homegrown values and self-reliance. She insisted on discipline, prayer, and hard work, traits George carried into adulthood. Although their relationship was occasionally strained, it's clear that Mary's influence helped shape her son's resilience and self-control. George didn't attend college, unlike many founding fathers. Instead, he was homeschooled and attended a local school where he studied arithmetic, geometry, and surveying. He also read books on manners and virtue, particularly Rules of Civility and Decent Behavior, which had a profound effect on his personal conduct. His penmanship and discipline, even at a young age, were impressive. These rules weren't just for show. Washington lived them. By age 15, George was already thinking practically. A naval officer career was proposed, but Mary refused, fearing it would remove him from the family. So George turned to surveying. Thanks to his older half-brother, Lawrence Washington, who married into the powerful Fairfax family, George secured his first real job as a surveyor at just 17 years old. It was dangerous, rough work in untamed territories, but it gave him valuable skills, not just in maps, but in leadership, negotiation, and independence. George began spending more time at Mount Vernon, the grand estate of his brother Lawrence. When Lawrence died of tuberculosis in 1752, George inherited the property, a monumental moment in his life. Mount Vernon became his anchor, his base, and eventually his symbol of legacy. In 1752, tragedy struck again. Washington's half-brother, Lawrence Washington, his mentor and closest male role model, died of tuberculosis. Shortly after, George inherited his colonel's commission in the Virginia militia, a decision more political than practical, but one that changed his destiny. Without formal military education, Washington relied on self-discipline, observation, and pure determination. By 1753, tension was boiling between the Marchon, British colonies, and French forces, pushing in from Canada. Native American tribes were caught between both powers. Virginia's governor needed someone brave and expendable to deliver a warning to the French: leave or face war. Washington, now just 21, was chosen. Washington's winter expedition to Fort Le Boeuf was grueling. He survived freezing temperatures, Indian ambushes, and near drowning, all before delivering the message and returning. The French ignored it. War was coming. In May 1754, Washington led a preemptive strike against a small French party near what is now Pennsylvania. With the help of native allies, including the fierce Tanacharison, the half-king, Washington ambushed and killed the French commander, Joseph Coulon de Jumonville. What Washington didn't realize was that Jumonville may have been on a diplomatic mission, not a military one. The French saw it as cold-blooded murder. Washington had fired the first shots of the French and Indian War. In retaliation, Washington hastily built Fort Necessity in a muddy meadow. It was barely defensible. On July 3, 1754, French forces surrounded it. After a day of heavy rain and gunfire, Washington was forced to surrender. Worse still, the surrender document he signed, written in French, accidentally admitted to assassinating Jumonville. Washington didn't speak French and likely didn't realize the wording, yet it gave the French powerful propaganda. This would be the only time Washington ever surrendered in his career, but he learned valuable lessons about preparation, logistics, and humility. Back in Virginia, rather than disgrace, Washington's daring earned him fame. He was promoted to commander of all Virginia troops. By age 23, a remarkable feat, but friction with British officers, who often looked down on colonial militias, frustrated him deeply. Still, he pushed on. Washington worked tirelessly to recruit, train, and supply his men, many of whom were poorly equipped and undisciplined. It was a crash course in leadership. In 1755, Washington joined General Edward Braddock's campaign to seize the strategic French Fort Duquesne, now Pittsburgh. Braddock dismissed native tactics and ignored colonial advice. It was a fatal mistake. Outside the fort, French and native forces ambushed the British in the Battle of the Monongahela. Chaos erupted. Braddock was fatally wounded. Officers fell rapidly. Washington, though sick with dysentery and not in command, rode fearlessly through the gunfire, rallying troops and carrying out Braddock's orders. 2 horses were shot out from under him. 4 bullets tore through his coat. He was untouched. Many called it divine protection. Washington's legend was growing. Despite his heroism, Washington never received a royal commission from the British, something he craved. The class-based British Army looked down on colonial officers. Disillusioned, he resigned in 1758, shortly after helping in the successful capture of Fort Duquesne. At just 26, Washington had experienced the brutality of war, the arrogance of empires, and the limits of colonial loyalty. By the end of 1758, George Washington returned to Mount Vernon a seasoned veteran. He wasn't yet a national hero, but he had become something even more important. A man ready to lead, no matter the odds. He'd faced failure, fought prejudice, and learned strategy under fire. In every way that mattered, the boy had become a commander. In June 1775, amid rising tensions and open rebellion in Massachusetts, Washington was unanimously chosen as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. He accepted, not because he craved power, but because he believed in the cause. He even refused a salary, asking only for his expenses to be covered. His presence, clad in military uniform, sent a message. America was at war. Washington took command in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in July 1775. What he found wasn't an army. It was a disorganized mix of volunteers, farmers, and militiamen. There were no uniforms, no discipline, and barely any ammunition. But Washington got to work, drilling, organizing, and, crucially, keeping morale alive. He laid siege to British-occupied Boston, and by March 1776, using cannons dragged from Fort Ticonderoga, he forced the British to evacuate. It was America's first major victory. Then came 1776, the year of the Declaration, in a series of humiliating defeats. Washington faced General William Howe's massive British army in New York. The Americans were outmaneuvered, outnumbered, and pushed back repeatedly. Washington's army was nearly destroyed, but instead of surrendering, he pulled off a series of daring escapes, including a legendary nighttime withdrawal across the East River under cover of fog. By December, Washington's army was freezing, demoralized, and on the brink of collapse. Many believed the revolution was over. Then came Trenton on a fury. Christmas night, 1776. Washington crossed the icy Delaware River with 2,400 men and surprised a garrison of Hessian mercenaries. The victory was swift and bold, and it reignited American hope. Days later, he struck again at Princeton. The tide was turning. In the winter of Woeward in 1777 to 78, Washington's army endured the brutal cold at Westjody de Valley Forge. Food was scarce, disease spread, morale was low, but Washington stayed. He ate what his men ate. He walked through the snow with them. He brought in the Prussian officer, Baron von Steuben, who trained the army into a real fighting force. By spring, the Continental Army emerged, transformed. From Monmouth to the Southern campaigns, Washington fought a slow, grinding war. He couldn't match British firepower, but he could outlast them. He avoided full destruction, wore the British down, and allowed American diplomats and allies, especially the French, to shift the tide. In 1781, everything came to a head at Warren-National. With French naval support and General Rochambeau at his side, Washington marched his troops south and laid siege to Yorktown, to Virginia. British General Cornwallis, trapped by land and sea, surrendered on October 19, 1781. It wasn't just a victory, it was the end of the war. Even after victory, Washington shocked the world by resigning his commission to Congress in 1783. He could have become a king. People would have followed him. Instead, he returned home to Mount Vernon. His message was clear. The people, not a man, should rule. King George III reportedly said, "If he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world." After defeating the British and resigning his command, Washington had hoped to retire to Mount Vernon for good, but the Articles of Confederation had failed. The country was fractured. A new constitution was in place, but it needed someone to breathe life into it. In 1789, Washington was unanimously elected, again, to lead. He didn't want the job, but he accepted it out of duty. On April 30th, 1789, Washington took the oath of office on the balcony of Federal Hall in New York City, the first capital of the United States. He wore a simple brown suit and held his hand over a Bible borrowed from a local Masonic lodge. The crowd below roared as he said the final words, "So help me God," a phrase not required, but added from his own conviction. A republic had officially begun. Washington's presidency was filled with firsts. There were no protocols, no rules for how a president should behave, so he invented the office as he went. With restraint, dignity, and caution, he established the cabinet, choosing strong-minded advisors like Thomas Jefferson, Secretary of State, and Alexander Hamilton, Treasury. These two clashed constantly, but Washington kept them both, believing balance was the key to unity. He knew every action he took would become a precedent. In 1791, Congress passed an excise tax on whiskey to help pay off war debts. Frontier farmers, especially in western Pennsylvania, were furious. Many used whiskey as currency. The protests escalated into the Marbalin. For the first time, Washington had to decide how far federal power should go. In a bold move, he personally led with 13,000 troops to suppress the uprising, the only sitting U.S. president ever to do so. The rebellion fizzled out, and the Constitution passed its first major test. Across the Atlantic, France America's revolutionary ally, erupted into its own bloody revolution. Many Americans wanted to support them, but Washington, with Hamilton's backing, chose neutrality. He believed the young nation couldn't afford another war. This angered Jefferson and the Francophile faction, but Washington stood firm. His Neutrality Proclamation of 1793 helped America stay stable during a time of global chaos. Washington's Jay Treaty with Britain in 1795 prevented another war and secured trade routes, but it sparked intense backlash. Many saw it as too favorable to the British. For the first time, Washington was heavily criticized in the press. Political parties began to form, Federalists versus Democratic Republicans, though Washington warned against them. In 1796, Washington shocked the country again by refusing a third term. He wanted to prove that American leaders should never become monarchs. His farewell address was more than a goodbye. It was a blueprint for the future. He warned against factionalism, foreign entanglements, and political tribalism. He stepped down peacefully, the first time in modern history a leader had voluntarily given up power after victory. In March 1797, Washington handed over power to John Adams. There were no riots, no coups, no royal heirs, just a quiet, orderly transition. It was an American miracle. In March 1797, Washington left the presidency and returned home to Mount Vernon, his cherished estate by the Potomac River. No parades, no motorcades, just fields to tend, letters to answer, and a house full of guests. He woke early, rode horseback across his farms, managed workers, and wrote prolifically. Despite his status, Washington found joy in agriculture, architecture, and experimentation. But he also watched the country closely, worried about rising partisanship, the future of democracy, and America's place in the world. In 1798, tensions with France reached a boiling point. A war, the quasi-war, seemed inevitable. President John Adams, knowing who the people trusted most, asked Washington to return and lead the U.S. Army once more, just in case. Washington agreed. Reluctantly, he accepted the title of one commander of the armies of the United States, but insisted Alexander Hamilton act as second in command. He didn't want fame. He wanted order, and above all, peace. Though war never came, Washington's presence calmed the nation and reaffirmed trust in its institutions. Washington spent his final years reconsidering his views on slavery, an issue that would haunt the nation long after his death. He was a slaveholder, yes, but in his final will, he made a bold move for his time. He ordered that all 123 of his enslaved people be freed upon Martha's death. He was the first and only founding father to do this. Was it enough? Number. But it was a crack in the wall, a step toward conscience. On December 12, 1799, Washington rode through rain and snow inspecting his estate. The next day, he had a sore throat, chills, and struggled to speak. By December 14, the illness worsened, likely acute epiglottitis, or laryngeal inflammation, not bloodletting, though 3 physicians did bleed him heavily. He remained calm and composed, saying only, "I die hard, but I am not afraid to go." At Prodige 1020 Missouri, George Washington passed away at the age of 67. The news spread like wildfire. Churches tolled their bells. Cities mourned. The young republic grieved as if it had lost its father, because it had. In Philadelphia, Congress wore black for a month. Across the colonies, funeral processions, sermons, and ceremonies took place. A marble cenotaph was planned for the capital. He would later be entombed at Mount Vernon. Napoleon Bonaparte, then ruler of France, even ordered a 10-day mourning period. not for Washington in the French army. His death was not just the loss of a man, it was the closing of an era. In his will, Washington laid out his vision for the future, from land to education to the freedom of his enslaved workers. He requested a simple burial with no grand monuments. He understood better than anyone, legacies aren't built on statues, they're built on principles.